Numbers chapter 11. Thank you, Pastor Rob, for opening up there. The bridge construction, McClure's throwing my timing off. Not that I'm a super early person anyways, but usually not this late. Numbers chapter 11. As we continue to look at I am the gracious giver, as God has been essentially providing for the needs of Israel now as they are journeying to the promised land. And of course, I've seen quite a few things as we've looked through this lengthy lesson of God providing for Israel, blessing Israel, telling them essentially that the promised land is coming, but also allowing them to have some difficulties along the journey because he didn't want them to get comfortable with the journey. He wanted them to be satisfied with the destination, right? And we saw that a little bit last week as Israel began to complain because they just weren't happy with the situation. They expected, I guess, the journey to be just as nice as the destination. And so because of that, they began to complain about God, complaining against God, complain because God wasn't providing for their needs like they thought that they should be providing with. Now, last week we saw the consequences of that as God just set fire to the outside of the camp because of their complaining. And it was out of nowhere, the outskirts of the camp there started on fire. People died. Things were burnt. People cried out to Moses. You prayed to God. Of course, God essentially turned the fire off. That's kind of what happened. Turned the fire on, turned the fire off, showing them their dissatisfaction. They're showing God his dissatisfaction. With them. And then we get to verse 4 of Numbers. And we see Israel here having another complaint. Now, this complaint probably was started or spearheaded by some of the foreigners that were within the camp. So probably some of the Egyptians that left with the Israelites when they left Egypt probably kind of began to start these murmurings, and the Israelites kind of picked up on it. And eventually the multitude was complaining and craving this meat and having a dissatisfaction. Now, as often here the case with Israel, as we're going to continue to see, they have an extremely short memory, right? They have a very, very short memory for God's goodness, God's blessing, but for whatever reason, they also seem to have a really short memory of God's judgment. They seem to forget what their complaining and their dissatisfaction with God oftentimes brings them. And we see it again now. So the next round of complaining starts in verse 4 here of chapter 11. And again, probably some of the other people that were with them who had left Egypt with them, probably mixed in with the multitude here, developed this craving for meat. So let's read read verses 4 down through 9. And we'll see Israel's dissatisfaction. And the mixed multitude that was among them fell lusting, and the children of Israel also wept again and said, Who shall give us flesh to eat? We remember the fish which we did eat in Egypt freely, the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. But now our soul is dried away. There is nothing at all besides this manna before our eyes. And the manna was a coriander seed, and the color thereof, the color of bdellium. And the people went about and gathered it, and ground it in mills for beat and in mortar, and baked it in pans, and made cakes of it. And the taste of it was the taste of fresh oil. And when the dew fell upon the camp at night, the manna fell upon it. How was God feeding the Israelites presently, right now, as we have them in our story? What's he giving them? Where is this manna coming from? Heaven. All right. What are they using the manna for?
Food.
pretty much everything, any type of food they want to. They're making all kinds of stuff. Manna is very versatile food, right? It has a very good taste, obviously, and they're able to use it for a variety of different things. Who is providing that manna for them? God, right? Has the manna stopped showing up? No. They have some rules and some guidelines they have to follow about collecting the manna and how they use it, but it's always there. They wake up in the morning, they know they have no need to worry about food while they're in the wilderness, while they're traveling to the promised land, but the food is always there. And again, God providing directly the manna for these people. The Israelites have gotten tired of eating manna. Essentially is what's happened here. Although it's being provided for them free, no charge, no nothing, right? Just there, outside their house in the morning. I'm not going to lie, I think it would be nice, especially on mornings we have to get up and get to work, and especially on mornings where I meet Mom and Pam with the girls. It would be nice if I could just walk outside and grab some manna on my way, right? It'd save me some time and make things pretty convenient. And that's essentially what the Israelites had here. We see them getting tired of eating the manna. So they voiced their complaint here, and they wanted some meat, right? Wanted something, some flesh, as it's called, or wanted to eat some meat. They hadn't been, their voices, complaining. Probably not long after the embers may not even have cooled down yet from the previous judgment God had just given them for complaining. Right? Things might have still been smoldering. So it hadn't been cool very long there, and Israel questions again, who's going to give us some meat to eat? They romanticized. It had gotten so bad for them. They romanticized about all of the things they ate freely in Egypt, right? We see that in verse 5. When we remember the fish which we did eat in Egypt, what? Was there anything about the Israelites that was free in Egypt? No, especially not this generation, right? This generation of Israelites their grandparents spent time in slavery. Their great-grandparents spent time in slavery, right? There was hundreds of years they were there. So they knew nothing of freedom. But to them, they were just freely eating fish and the cucumbers and melons and all the great things that Egypt had to offer. They were romanticizing about the stuff they were able to eat. Now, the Egyptians, probably did allow the Israelites to eat the fish that would have been pretty readily found in the rivers and the waterways of Egypt. But the Egyptians, for the most part, weren't good masters, right? Weren't good masters at all. So not only is this offensive to God that they're complaining that they're not satisfied with what He is providing them, but it's also offensive to God that for them to think that Israel is actually a better place for them to be than where God has brought them to now. As you think about it, even while they're eating the fish and the melons and the cucumbers or whatever in Egypt, who was actually providing that stuff for them? It wasn't the Egyptians, right? It was God. God was ultimately providing that food for them while they were in slavery in Egypt. Not the Egyptians or anyone else, and not even themselves. So when remembering their past, Israel should have praised God for the fact that they could get up and knew that manna was always going to be there, because God was providing for their needs. He was giving them the provision of food in the midst of some pretty terrible circumstances even in Egypt. So it sounds to me as if these slaves were eating pretty good even while they were slaves. But that was because of God's hand. Israel here is overstating their current situation, saying that in verse 6, right? It's so bad, the Israelites are so bad that they're so hungry, or they have such need for meat that it says what? But now our what? Our soul is dried away. It's just dried up, just so starved to death. Now, there's just nothing around but manna. All they see is manna. Manna everywhere that God has given them. Come on, people. Right? They're just vexed in their soul. It's just so terrible that the only thing they can have to eat is manna. That's all they see. Although the manna was providing them their nutrition, it was keeping them alive in an otherwise completely unforgiving wilderness. It's always there, always available to them. They still weren't satisfied. Now, verses 7, 8, and 9 that we see, this description of manna, what they were using it for, how it was used, is actually, as we'll see later on, a huge benefit for future generations, right? Let's look back again what they were able to do with the manna. And the manna was a coriander seed, and the color thereof was bdellium. And the people went about and gathered it and ground it in mills, beat it in mortar, baked it in pans, made cakes of it, and the taste of it was a taste of fresh oil. And when the dew fell upon camp in the night, the manna fell upon it. So the description of what they were able to do and what it tastes like and all these things, it was going to be a blessing for these future generations, but the current generation couldn't have been more familiar with it. They were getting to the point where they were tired of eating it. They didn't want to look at it. They loathed it. I'll admit, I've had, when we just had Moxie, we ate spaghetti at the house like 3 times a week. For whatever reason, it's what she wanted. And we ate it a lot, which was fine. She was making it, and people liked it. It was something she would eat. But it got to the point like 3 weeks in, I was like, oh, I can't eat any more spaghetti. This is just the look of it makes me want to. And that's kind of where the Israelites are here, right? They just continue to eat, and they got to the point where they're just like, I just can't stand this anymore. But unlike, I guess, me, would have maybe had other options, but it wasn't being directly provided from God in the morning, right? I mean, there was nothing else to eat. If it wasn't for the manna, there was nothing, right? I mean, there was nothing else. If it wasn't for the manna, they were going to die. And God's continuing to provide it for them. Yet they still complained and loathed. Now, Moses, the fearless leader here, this poor old boy, he hears these complaints. And he has to then deal with these complaints. And Moses quickly here grows very tired and weary of listening to these people complain about God providing for them. So he takes his weariness to God and asks why he was responsible for people that he had not conceived. We see Moses here kind of getting exasperated with the Israelites. Verse 10. Then Moses heard the people weep throughout their families, every man in the door of his tent, and the anger of the Lord was kindled greatly. Moses also was displeased. And Moses said unto the Lord, Wherefore hast thou afflicted thy servant, and wherefore have I not found favor in thy sight, that thou layest the burden of all this people upon me? Have I conceived all this people? Have I begotten them, that they should say unto me, Carry them in thy bosom, as a nursing father beareth a sucking child, unto the land which thou swearest unto their fathers? Whence should I have flesh to give unto all these people? For they weep unto me, saying, Give us flesh that we may eat. I am not able to bear all this people alone, because it's too heavy for me. And if thou dealt thus with me, kill me, I pray thee, out of the hand, if I found favor in thy sight, and let me not see my wretchedness. So Moses gets sick of this very quickly, tired of the belly aching and complaining, takes his weariness, this concern, this over itness to God, and asks God. He's kind of like, God, I didn't birth these people, right? These aren't my actual kids. These aren't my children. I didn't take these babies to raise. Why am I in charge of them? Why have you done this to me? Essentially is what he's saying. You can feel the exasperation in Moses' words here as he's going and going to God. Not complaining, but maybe a little bit, why God has caused him to have to deal with this burden. He told God he was tired of taking care of other people's kids. Sick of it. He had enough of it. They don't get it. They don't understand. We're continually to doing all these things for them. You're blessing them over and over and over, and then they still don't get it. I'm tired of it, God. I'm tired of having to deal with it. So he asked God where he could possibly find meat for all the people. suggesting he believed that it was going to be an impossible obstacle to overcome. And overwhelmed here by the task of caring for probably more than 2 million people, Moses asked God to do what? In verses 14 and 15. What's he say in verse 14 of chapter 11? Just take me out of here. Just kill me. This is not worth it. I can't do it anymore. Just kill me. Just take my life from me. So we can kind of see just how exasperated Moses is here. Just take his life, if that was the way God was how things were going to be. Obviously, Moses here has a troubled heart, right? The task was too much for him to bear, and he's at wit's end. So verse 16 down through verse 35 here, we see the response from God. God's going to respond here to both Moses and to the people. All right? Verses 16 and 17. So it was... wrong chapter. And the Lord said unto Moses, Gather unto me 70 men of the elders of Israel, whom thou knowest to be the elders of the people, and officers over them, and bring them unto the tabernacle of the congregation, that they may stand there with thee. And I will come down and talk with thee there. And I will talk of the Spirit. I will talk of the Spirit which is upon thee, and will put it upon them. They shall bear the burden of the people with thee, that thou bear it not thyself alone. So God responds, sees the exasperation here on Moses' face, and gives him the ability here, gives him the opportunity to appoint 70 men, of whom he would bring his spirit on, so that they could help Moses here. So Moses is going to go out and find 70 elders, probably 70 people that he knew very well, 70 of his buddies, close friends, or maybe not close friends, probably won't have 70 close friends, but 70 people that trusted and knew well, and probably well respected in the communities and different tribes. And God's going to bring his spirit to them so that they can help Moses. Now, perhaps here the unspoken rebuke for Moses for complaining and not trusting fully in God was that he could have had help had he just simply asked. Right? And it might have been unspoken. Moses, if you'd just asked me, I would have made sure you got some help. Because we see that God was, as soon as Moses asked, God was what? Ready with the plan to help ease his burden. So maybe Moses 2 weeks ago would have asked this, he wouldn't have been quite to this point. But he hadn't. But when he finally gets to the point that he does, God allows him and gives him this response. Then we get to verse 18, though, we see God's response to Israel. And it's not as nice, right? This is not as helpful as it was for Moses. God responds to Israel with one of judgment. He's going to give them some meat to eat, but he's going to use it to judge them. Verse 18. So Moses gets you 70 people to help you. Take them to the tabernacle, let them be amongst it, and I'll walk with them and talk to them and help you share the burden. But for the people, for the rest of these dum-dums that won't figure out what's going on, say thou unto the people, Sanctify yourselves against tomorrow, and ye shall eat flesh. For ye have wept in the ears of the Lord, saying, Who shall give us flesh to eat? For it was well with us in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you flesh, and ye shall eat. Ye shall not eat 1 day, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, neither 10 days, nor 20 days, but even a whole month, until it come out your nostrils, and it be loathsome unto you, because that ye have despised the Lord which is among you, and have wept before him, saying, Why came we forth out of Egypt? So we see God responding here, that he's going to give Israel the meat to eat, but he's going to use it to judgment. We're going to talk about here in just a second. Now, why was Israel's complaining about God's provision, or why was there just complaining in general? Why was that so serious? Why is this such a serious offense here? What was the words they used about the manna? They what? Right? Well, about seeing the manna. What was the response about seeing the manna? They loathed it, right? They loathed it. So they were loathing God's provision. Therefore, they're loathing God. So we see the seriousness here of their offense. Before their eyes, I can't eat any more spaghetti, right? I can't eat any more manna. That's what they were saying. What they meant was that God, all he's given us is manna. If he can give us manna, he can give us meat. Right? They're loathing God. So that's how the seriousness, they're showing that they despise God. By saying that they wanted to go back to Egypt where things were much better, they were implying that they wish God wasn't with them at all and he'd simply just left them alone in Egypt. So God says, all right, people, you want some meat? I'll give you meat. Israel would have to eat so much meat that it says in verse 18, verse 20, excuse me. They're going to eat so much meat that it's going to do what? In first part of verse 20. Going to come, what's it say in verse 20? But even a whole month until it does what? Comes out your nose. Going to eat so much meat that you're going to vomit and it's going to come out your nose. The picture of them gorging themselves on the meat, trying to find satisfaction in it. That's why he says you'll eat not one day, not 10 days, not 20 days, but for a whole month. They're going to eat and eat and eat and gorge themselves on the meat so much, trying to find satisfaction because they think, man, if I just had some fish, I'd feel a lot better. So God says, all right, here's your meat. You're going to eat it, and you're not going to be satisfied with it. You're going to eat so much of it, it's going to come out your nostrils. It's the only way meat can come out your nostrils. By vomiting it up, because you've overeaten and overgorged yourself on it. Why would the Israelites not find satisfaction in eating the meat God was going to give them? It's going to make them sick, but on a spiritual level, why? True satisfaction and peace comes from what? Trust and obey. Right relations to God and trusting in him no matter the circumstances. Right relations in God and trusting in him no matter the circumstances. If the Israelites had been fully trusting in God, the manna would have been just enough. They would have never even thought, man, fish would taste good right now. It's been 3 weeks and nothing but manna, man, some fish would taste good right now. They had been fully trusting in him and not being concerned with the circumstances. What God had provided would be enough. Israel already had all that they needed to find peace and satisfaction in the current situation. Manna was God's gracious gift, that he was God's gracious provision that he was providing for their needs. But when they looked at the manna, that was not what they saw and not what they concluded. They didn't conclude that God was the giver of good blessings. Instead, they believed he was the one responsible from keeping them from the ultimate satisfaction. They're blaming God for keeping them from being ultimately fulfilled. God's got to be holding out on us. If all he's giving us is his same old manna every day, and he's promised all this stuff in the promised land, he's got to be holding out on us. And if he's holding out on us, there's no sense of us having him around. He's not blessing us like he said he was going to. They despise God's presence, they despise God's provision, and they long to be out from underneath his leadership. Now, verse 21, Moses interprets God's judgment here, and he has some doubts kind of his own. Right? So let's look at verse 21. And Moses said, the people among whom I am are 600,000 footmen. And thou hast said, I will give them flesh, that they may eat a whole month. Shall the flocks and the herds be slain for them to suffice them? Or shall all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them to suffice them? And the Lord said to Moses, is the Lord's hand waxed short? Thou shalt see now whether my word shall come to pass unto me or not. So Moses sees this and understands that there's just going to be 2 million people that's going to be eating meat here. How in the world is this going to get done? Moses also, right? Moses is a great leader and a fantastic man of faith. He does stuff that we probably would never be able to do. Moses also, though, has problems trusting in God as well, right? We see it at the burning bush. We see it a couple times as they're in Egypt. We see it now, him kind of questioning God in certain situations. And God has been incredibly patient with Moses, right? Moses comes, and this, I couldn't wrap my head around this as I was kind of going through this week. Moses comes, after he hears this judgment from God, that they're going to have enough meat for everybody to eat for an entire month. There's going to be so much meat to the point that they're going to make themselves sick. And Moses looks at God and says, how in the world are we going to have to kill all the sheep and the goats and the cows? Are we going to go and pull all the fish out of the river? It seems to me like Moses would just think that, you know what, every morning we wake up and there's what? God has given us manna. Why can't God just give us enough? How is he not going to be able to provide for us enough meat? I'm not saying Moses is a slow man. It's just sometimes I wonder if he was so concerned, if Moses was so concerned with his own weariness of trying to lead these people, that he forgot about the burning bush, that he forgot about the parting of the Red Sea, that he forgot about all the other plagues that God brought in, and that Moses was intrinsically a part of. Moses was there, and he saw all these things happen. Moses has seen the Red Sea, walked across. He was the first person to put his foot on that dry ground, right? Moses has seen the manna come down and all these things, and yet he has the audacity here to ask God, how in the world are we going to do this? How are we going to have enough meat for these people? It's like God is look at the manna, right? You see, you can kind of see God's here a little bit. You can get why that we see here, but why God kind of, come on, Moses, come on, man. So he has a concern for how this is going to be possible, and he questions where God's going to come up with this tremendous amount, because from a human perspective here, he may have a valid point, but of course we know God is sovereign. God is transcendent. He does not work on our finite human our finite human scale. So he asked Moses in verse 23. And the Lord said unto Moses, is the Lord's hand vexed short? Obviously here this is a rhetorical question that he's asking Moses. And God said Moses would witness his ability to do as he desires, thereby rebuking Moses' lack of faith. Thou shalt see now, verse 23, whether my word shall come to pass unto thee or not. Verse 24, Moses went out and told the people of the words of the Lord, and gathered the 70 men of the elders of the people, and set them round about in the tabernacle. And the Lord came down in the cloud and spake unto him, and took the spirit that was upon him, and gave him to the 70 elders. And it came to pass that when the spirit rested upon them, they prophesied and did not cease. But there remained two of the men in the camp. The name of the one was Eldad, and the name of the other was Medad. And the Spirit rested upon them, and they were of them that were written, but went not out unto the tabernacle, and they prophesied in the camp. And there ran a young man, and told Moses, and said, Eldad and Medad do prophecy in the camp. And Joshua the son of Nun, a servant of Moses, one of the young men, answered and said, My Lord Moses, forbid them. And Moses said unto him, Enviest thou for my sake? Would God that all the Lord's people were prophets, and that the Lord would put his spirit upon them. And Moses got him into the camp, he and the elders of Israel. So God tells Moses, rebukes Moses for his lack of faith, and then Moses then proceeds to leave to tell the people of the word that he's just heard from God. And as God promised, a spirit came on the elders, the 70 elders, who gathered around the tabernacle, or 68 elders, I guess, as well as the two that didn't come to the assembly, Eldad and Medad. Okay. Obviously, no doubt here that these other 68 men become a tremendous help to Moses, both spiritually and from an administrative standpoint. But we see that we have Eldad and Medad as well there. That even though they didn't come to the assembly, the Spirit was on them as well. We see them prophesying there. And just as God has said, verses 31 and 32, he begins to provide for the Israelites. Verse 31, and there went forth a wind from the Lord, and brought quails from the sea, and let them fall by the camp, as it were a day's journey on the side, and as it were a day's journey on the other side, round about the camp, and as it were 2 cubits high upon the face of the earth. So, God then sends in this wind of quails. Okay? And the quails come into Israel's camp from each direction. And we see that if you were standing at the edge of the camp, and the quails that quails came in and they just, I don't know if they dropped dead or they just sat there and waited for the people to come pick them up. We don't know what the case may be, but we know that if you're standing on the edge of the camp and you looked out and looked at the quails, we'd see that the quails all the way around the camp were so far that it would be a day's journey to get to the end of it. And they were stacked up 2 cubits high. That's how many quails just showed up all at once. You could even probably all you could see was quail for as long as you could see, stacked up to your hip, if not higher. And the people stood up all that day and all that night, verse 32, and all the next day, and they gathered the quails. And that gathered 10 homers, and they spread them all abroad for themselves round about the camp. And while the flesh was yet between their teeth, ere it was chewed, the wrath of the Lord was kindled against the people, and the Lord smote the people with a very great plague. And he called the name of the place, I've been working on this one, Kibroth Hattaavah, because there they buried the people that lusted. And the people journeyed from Kibroth Hattaavah unto Hazeroth, and abode at Hazeroth. So God sends the quails in from every direction. The people here being so excited that there's meat around, and believing that the meat would bring them some contentment, that they actually stayed up all night long bringing in the birds, right? They collected birds all night long. We see in verse 31 and 32. So they're out there, they're just picking all the quails, got bags, buckets, whatever they're in, collecting all the quails they can possibly collect. And they bring them in, and they prepare it, and it's just probably in there, plucking the feathers off, getting the stuff off, cooking it, whatever they had to do to get it ready. And they all sat down and had this probably beautiful, luscious looking quail. And before they could even chance to take a bite of it, right? Before they could even get it in their mouths to chew their very first bite of, what did God do? Plague come in, right? God brought a plague and struck them down with a plague, killing some of them while the meat was in their mouth before they even had a chance to chew it. And they called the place Kibroth Hattaavah, which actually means the graves of craving. Go to 1 Timothy 6:6. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 6. What would Israel have gained with contentment? What would Israel have gained by being content with the manna? 1 Timothy 6:6. But what? With what? Contentment is great gain. But godliness with contentment is great gain. The Israelites would have gained by being content with the manna, first of all, their lives. Secondly, a fellowship with God, peace and joy. Be satisfied with what God has blessed you with. Be satisfied with what God has blessed you with. Because Job said, the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. All right? Blessed be the name of the Lord. God has blessed us richly, more than we deserve, more than we can possibly ever repay. It's important for us to be content with what God has blessed us with. Now, Israel moves on from Kibroth Hattaavah to Hazeroth. No doubt they wanted to leave they wanted to leave the graves of the craving far behind them. But as they get to Hazeroth, and as we'll get into next week in Numbers chapter 12, it's going to bring having some of their own problems as well. So we've had the people complain against, the Israelites complain against God and Moses. We've had some of the foreigners lead a complaint against to Moses about God. And we think, poor Moses here. We get to chapter 12 next week. We're going to see that who else is going to criticize or complain against Moses. It's not bad enough that the people he's trying to lead, that it gets to his own brother and sister are going to start to complain and criticize Moses as well. Now, this next criticism of Moses is built from jealousy, and it stems from some jealousy, but they're going to criticize Moses as he selects here a wife. And as we're going to see next week, they speak out against the wife because she's what? She's not an Israelite, she's an Ethiopian, okay? She's an Ethiopian, and it's going to have some problems. They're going to complain and give Moses some problems. And what we're going to see is it's not the complaint about Moses' marriage. It's not really the problem. The root of the problem is their relationship with God, as is always the case when Christians complain. Let's call a spade a spade. When we become dissatisfied with what God has blessed us with, and we begin to murmur and complain about it, we are not complaining about what God has blessed us with. We're complaining against God. Dissatisfaction with God's blessing is not because of the blessing itself, it's because we are dissatisfied with God. And that shows a problem or a hiccup or an area that needs addressed in our relationship with God. Okay? Because godliness leads or gives contentment. Contentment gives peace and joy. Okay, that's how it all works. I'm not happy with what God's tired of eating the spaghetti. Haley says, make some food yourself, right? I mean, that's kind of the concept here, right? When it's not that I was tired of eating the spaghetti, come on, woman, I think you can make something else, right? And that's kind of the root of the problem here. We're not that we're upset with the blessing, but we're upset with God. And that's what we're going to see next week as well. And we kind of continue to dive into some of these criticisms and some of these complaints that these people have against God. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the lesson that we have. Thank you for being able to see, Lord, just even in the midst of these people complaining and carrying on about stuff, the provisions for them, Lord, you had to judge them, Lord, and correct them, but you continued to provide for them, and you could turn the men off whenever you wanted to. Quit providing for them, and as Moses said, let these people just die where they're at. But you've made a promise, and you're faithful to that promise because that's who you are, Lord. So we thank you. Thank you for being faithful to your promises, Lord. And I pray that as we continue to look through some of these scenarios and situations, that Lord, we gain a greater sense of being content with the blessings you've blessed us with. You've already blessed us, Lord, far more richly than we ever deserved, we can ever repay. And I think it's important for us to be content in the situations and in living situations or things that you've blessed us with, Lord, and know that all good things come from you, Lord. And we thank you so much for it. May we not stray away from that. May we not become dissatisfied. But we find contentment and peace, Lord, in serving you. Because we know that in serving you, you have promised us, Lord, you take care of the birds, you take care of the sparrow, you make all those other things to happen that seem maybe not such a big deal to us. If you take such great care to have concern yourself with the sparrow, Lord, of course you're going to make sure that we're taken care of as well. I pray that's a thing, the important fact that we remember. Lord, I pray for Pastor Rob as he comes here the next little bit as well. To just use him in a mighty way. Lord, keep us attentive to the word you have for us.